I think it's time to switch now to Dr. Valdez. Again, thank you, Dr. Leroy.
Let me just move this around. Very good. Thank you very much, and hi again to everyone. I think they were very good talks, really putting things into perspective, which is what we wanted to achieve here. So now what I'm going to do is go a little bit to getting into the hearing aid technology, particularly how does hearing aid impact brain health? And this is something, it's not a very straightforward topic, as I found while I was preparing this talk. So it's going to be a really good perspective in that sense. I just have to say a couple of disclosures, and most of the data presented here is a review of published work, so it's not my original research. I do have previous working relationships with Otic. I was part of the Eric Sohm Research Center for 5 years, from 2016 to 2021. And I'm receiving the speaker honorarium from Otic expert for this talk. So let's talk about hearing loss and cognition. So the evidence points to a consistent effect on hearing loss on cognitive decline. And Piers was alluding to some of those studies, as did ESMA as well. And I would like just to stratify it a little bit in terms of where is that evidence been coming from. So we've had observational cross-sectional studies showing that an increased deficit in cognition in people with hearing loss, particularly establishing that around 25 dB of hearing loss would be equivalent to around 7 years of accelerated aging effect. And this was replicated in 2 different studies from Frank Lin's group, where they looked at the normal progression of cognitive scoring cognitive testing throughout age or related to age, and the ones related to hearing loss. And this is quite a striking finding, I believe. We also have longitudinal studies that are showing a faster rate of decline in cognition, particularly associated with when you're following cohorts of people over years. And this is thanks to the longitudinal studies that have been done around the world. And it's about 41 to 32% faster decline with people with hearing loss than normal controls. And this is also depending on the dosage. So people who have higher degree of hearing loss have a faster rate of decline than those that have a milder or moderate hearing loss. And more meta-analyses are showing that there's an association with cognitive decline and the risk of cognitive impairment and incident dementia. And this has been replicated now in 3 different meta-analyses. One that has already been pointed out, the Lancet report by Jay Livingston, but also most recently in 2021, a paper by Ling et al. Showing as well this association. And as Piers noted, these are epidemiological and observational studies. So there's still a lot of things to question in relation to the links between hearing loss and cognition and the causality of it. But there is definitely a link there that needs to be further explored. So just to do a recap on the common links or proposed mechanisms, Piers tapped into all of them, but we're just going to have a graphical description of this. And this is the one that Piers was alluding to in terms of the cognitive load mechanism. And this tells us that we as individuals have limited cognitive resources, and we have to allocate those resources to all of the tasks that we're doing at any given time. So when there is a hearing impairment, there is a reallocation of those cognitive resources for more effortful listening, particularly trying to understand the message and relate the message. So those higher order processes that Piers was mentioning in his presentation. And that can lead to an accelerated neurodegeneration and brain atrophy. Another mechanism that is being proposed is the common cause. So this idea that there is a common denominator between the effects of cognitive impairment and hearing loss, which entails will tell us that there is a non-direct link between hearing loss and cognitive impairment, but more an associative link between cognitive impairment and hearing loss. Another effect would be the so-called cascade effect, and this is also what Piers was alluding to in terms of what could hearing loss cause that would lead towards cognitive impairment. And that could be two different avenues. One could go towards social isolation and depression, which could potentially lead to cognitive impairment. And the other one would be to the more neurological functional structures of the brain, with receiving less input, and because of that trigger structural changes in the brain because of neuroplasticity, or that would trigger some brain or volume atrophy. And lastly, another common schematic for the link between hearing loss and cognitive impairment is that there is a associative link between the two of them. So is the presence of hearing loss a harbinger for cognitive impairment, meaning that if we have some hearing loss, maybe there is an early sign that there is some cognitive decline coming our way. And in the other hand, is the presence of hearing loss a confounding factor for diagnosing cognitive impairment, meaning that we are overdiagnosing or misdiagnosing cognitive impairment because there's a presence of hearing loss that hasn't been treated. And both Irasema and Pierce have alluded to some of those mechanisms. Now, it's important to say that these mechanisms are not exclusive of each other. It doesn't mean that because one is true, the other one is not true. It's just different ways in which we're looking at this problem. And there's evidence to support all of this mechanisms. So it's important to understand that this is not a limited solution or limited vision. More, it's a way to explain different confounding factors that we find in research. So how do we expect then hearing aids to play a role into this whole pictures? And again, Uchida and I did a really good job at depicting this. So if we have hearing aids, we're hoping to ameliorate or diminish the listening effort of individuals, which would allow individuals to reallocate resources again for other tasks. So that is the biggest effect that we can hope for hearing aids here. And as Piers was mentioning, listening effort is one of the most active areas of research when it comes to hearing aid technology. We also have in the scenario of the common cause, well, because there is not a direct link in this case between hearing loss and cognitive impairment, we wouldn't expect hearing aids to have a big impact on cognitive impairment. So we would be treating just the component of hearing loss brought about by this common cause. In the case of the cascade effect, we can expect that the presence of hearing aids could eliminate the cascading effect at the early stages or at the early sources of the cascade. So at the reservoir, basically. By the introduction of hearing aids, we have a better verbal communication. So we don't have that decrease in socialization, and we could eventually prevent social isolation and apathy, or we provide proper input to the auditory cortices, which will regenerate the stimulation of the brain requires, reverse some of the cross-modal plasticity, and prevent from structural changes from happening. And lastly, in the last scenario, if we have hearing aids, well, there are two things that may happen. In the most evident one, in case A, or the circle A, is really reducing the amount of misdiagnosis of cognitive impairment because of hearing loss. So being able to actually be able to identify true cognitive impairment because of cognitive reasons, of neuropathological reasons, and decrease the overestimation of that. Now, if there is a common component of hearing loss and cognitive impairment, there's still the question whether or not hearing aids can reduce that component or can revert some of that cognitive impairment or slow the progression towards mild cognitive impairment or dementia. So then that brings us to evaluating the role of hearing aids on cognition. So we see that there is a link between hearing loss and cognition. What is the role of hearing aids and cognition? And I put a little asterisk here because there is a bidirectionality in this sentence. You could also evaluate the role of cognition on hearing aids. And that is what brought about the field of cognitive hearing science, with the belief that people with higher cognitive resources would be better at using the hearing aids and would perform better with hearing technology. Here is the other way around. We're trying to look at how do hearing aids affect cognition. And again, stratifying some of the evidence coming from the literature, we know that cross-sectional studies show that hearing aid use is associated with better cognition, independent of the effects that social cognition have, or the effects associated with hearing aid use and social isolation and depression. So this is very interesting to see. We also have longitudinal studies showing that the use of hearing aids may help mitigate cognitive decline associated with hearing loss. And this is hearing aid users having lower hazard ratios and slower mild cognitive impairment progression rates with respect to non-users, but no difference to controls. And this is data that is coming in two different longitudinal databases looking at patients over 12 and 25 years. So again, we're looking at the effect of having hearing aid use brings the progression towards cognitive impairment at the same level as non-hearing aid users without hearing loss. What about randomized controlled trials? Do we have the actual evidence that tells us that the intervention of hearing aids actually prevents or slows the progression to cognitive impairment? Well, as Irasema mentioned, they are coming. So we have two different randomized controlled trials that are being evaluated at the moment. One of them is the within the Achieve project, looking at about 850 adults over 70, between 70 and 84 years of age with mild or moderate hearing impairment. And the primary outcome is to look at change in global cognition over 3 years. There's also the HEARCOG trial, which is an interesting randomized control trial looking at 180 adults, 70 or older, with mild cognitive impairment and hearing loss. The interesting design here is that there's a delay start over 24 months. So one group is going to start with a hearing aid intervention from the beginning, and 12 months later, another group will start with this same intervention. And the idea is to see if there is, first of all, a progression associated with the intervention without the use of hearing aids, and then also to see if there is a reversal on cognitive capacity by using hearing aids even after 12 months. So these randomized control trials are key trials to understand whether or not hearing aids as an intervention will have an impact on mild cognitive impairment or incidence dementia. But one big question, again, to put here is, do we need hearing loss treatment to show effectiveness on randomized control trials, to consider them as impactful on brain health? What happens if this is not a direct association with mild cognitive impairment or dementia? Well, let's not forget that brain health is a state of brain functioning across multiple domains, irrespective of disorders, and it's a lifelong journey. So there is reason to believe that the value of impacting brain health with hearing aids and hearing interventions goes beyond the fact that may or may not reverse dementia. So again, we have a big overlap. So let's not forget that that part is there. So even though we could have a relationship of hearing aids within the disease, there is definitely a relationship between hearing aids and hearing loss intervention with brain health. And that in itself is already a valuable aspect of things. So this leads us to another question, which is, how can we leverage hearing aid innovations for brain health benefits? And every hearing aid manufacturer is looking into different innovations and putting technology under the hood of their devices. So how are we actually able to put that to benefit of brain health? And this is something that I set to look for this perspective talk. And what I found was that it's actually very early stages. So this is the hearing aid technological suite. And I call it the technological suite because most hearing devices have this under the hood, or will start having this under the hood. Of course, different manufacturers will champion different advances in different technology, but when you look at 4 or 5 years down the line after one innovations come out, most of the industry has adopted it. And we're talking about data logging and big data, for example. We're talking about artificial intelligence and neural networks in our hearing aid devices. Talking about new sensors and sensor fusion, for example, like the use of accelerometers in hearing aid devices, and connectivity and integration. How does the hearing aid connect with other wearables that we may already be using, or with our smartphones, or with the cloud, or with any other systems? And how does that affect the different domains that brain health spans across? So how can we use this technology for cognitive effects, for social and emotional effects, motor effects, behavioral and sensory effects? Of course, when we talk about hearing aid technology, innovations are driven by audiological purposes. And if there is no audiological benefit, it's unlikely that this is going to be out in the market. However, that already spans the opportunity to work towards the different aspects. So the potential of the technological impact on brain health, it's early stages. As I said, there's not a lot of evidence of this technological suite being used for brain health particularly, but there is evidence to show that consistent hearing aid may have an impact on neuronal communication mechanisms and neuroplasticity, particularly looking at normalization of neural oscillations associated with working memory in children, when the devices are being used about 8.5 hours a day. So what does consistent hearing aid mean? We are able to start to look at the dosage, the necessary dosage of adherence in order to have these effects happening. And more so with the data logging capabilities, we are able to monitor that without having to rely on self-reported measures. We also have that the correct use of well-fitted hearing aids promotes a reorganization of cortical wiring and reversal of cross-modal plasticity in the presence of age-related hearing loss. And this is fantastic work by Anu Sharma's lab, showing that there is, first of all, in the absence of hearing aids and the presence of hearing loss, areas of the brain that are normally associated to hearing get used or get utilized for more visual processing. So you start to see that change in function of that area. But within 6 months of correct use and well-fitted hearing aids, you start to see a reversal towards more hearing-associated tasks in those same regions. So there is that really big evidence of cortical reorganization that is required to enhance hearing and possibly ameliorate cognitive load in that respect. So the potential of data logging and big data and neural networks remains to be seen. However, we know that most of the devices now have data logging and data collection beyond basic usage. So not only what program were you using at what time have you used it, but a bit more granularity on what environment were you using it at, what is the signal to noise ratio. And this is information that has been used for developing, particularly one example is the division of hearing fitness with Otic, being able to use more of this individualized data for personalization of hearing care. Spanning through that effort, there was a big European project called Evotion, which was happening while the time that I was at Ericsson, which was using big data and integration with other sensor technologies, particularly smartwatches, to bring about insights about sensory stress in individuals. And this was a very nice study showing that heart rate was increasing when loud environments were being present. So suggesting that there was a sensory stress in loud environments. However, the rate in which the heart rate was increasing was depending on the quality of the soundscape, meaning that if there was a very large signal to noise ratio, that means there was a very favorable environment, the heart rate was increasing at a lower rate than when the signal to noise ratio was bad, meaning that we could identify that poor quality acoustic environments bring higher stress to individuals. And this is already important because you could design strategies around that, design strategies around policy in terms of soundscape requirements, but also be able to talk to the user and incite the user to look for the sound environments that are better, more beneficial for them and less stressful for them, which would entail have already an impact on brain health. Otic's and Vidic's latest noise reduction algorithms already make use of artificial intelligence and neural networks for scene identification. And this is very important because the device itself now is capable of doing scene analysis, scene recognition. Being able to have that information on top of everything not only helps us in the audiological sense, but it could also tell us something about the dwelling of our individuals. So what scenarios are they more involved in? Are they more in social environments? Are they more in quiet environments, in outdoor environments, or indoor environments? That can help us paint a picture beyond audiological benefits and into behavioral patterns of individuals that could then be used for aggregating information towards brain health assessments. And the inclusion of sensors can promote ecological hearing and intent-driven devices. And I think Elaine, in the later talk, will have a lot to say about this. But we can see that the inclusion of motion-based directionality, for example, that has been shown to have accurate step tracking and fall detection, is also very, very well accepted. So this idea that not only my hearing device is more reactive to my situation, whether I am walking or stationary, there is a possibility to use these sensors for other aspects of brain health, particularly thinking about frailty. Frailty is this diminishing of independence in motor function, more prone to falls, more prone to slow gait, for example. And these sensors could already start to tell us something about these aspects of brain health that could be very important to look at. So we do have potential for using the technological suite of hearing devices for other than audiological benefits. The problem, as I said, is that this is still very limited. One of the other sensor inclusions here could be cognitive controlled hearing devices. And this is part of the COCO-HAB project in which I worked for almost 5 years back at Ericsson. The idea here is to close the loop between what the user intends to listen to and what is actually being amplified by the noise reduction mechanisms. But I won't go too much into detail with that because I know Elaine has prepared a nice talk for us with some of those aspects. So we have the technological suite in hearing devices, and we have the domains across which the brain health can really have an impact. The problem at the moment is that there's a gap in knowledge, which gives us rise to great opportunities. And one of the things that I was particularly attuned in Irasema's talk and also in Pier's talk is that we have an opportunity to redefine how we interact between the hearing field and the memory field or the brain health field. So how do we start building these bridges between hearing loss and brain health? And one of the things that comes to mind really is redefining the patient journey. The patient journey are those experiences and processes that stakeholders go through during a disease and its treatment, right? And this is an example of a patient journey development that we did while I was at Ericsson. Came from a project called Appetite for Life. And the idea of this project was to see how does the role of apps, e-health apps, would play into a hearing aid user, and how does the client journey looks then? What you see here, let me see, put my pointer out. In white, you see the traditional steps of the normal client journey for audiology. So someone that has struggles to listen, it starts to find some information about it, gets the screening test, identifies whether or not there's a hearing loss, goes to the audiologist, gets a proper diagnosis and fitted hearing devices, and off it goes into the world. How does this change when we put the role of technology into it? Particularly in this case, it was with the development of apps that would have more information, more training, and more setting of goals and expectations capability. So then you start to have all these different steps that were identified, not by hearing care professionals, but by a combination of hearing care professionals, hearing aid users, hearing aid users' partners or caregivers, and all together came to this more rich and nuanced patient journey. What I see here with brain health is a similar situation, where we need to find in which points of our patient journey can we interact with other stakeholders, caregivers, spouses, partners, and other medical professionals, particularly looking at the need for understanding brain health along the whole process. And this is particularly important because we understand that brain health is a lifelong journey. And we also understand that there is brain health beyond the remit of neurological diseases. So it's important to be able to find those collaboration spots between the patient journey for hearing loss and cognition or brain health. So we have additional stakeholders that have different needs. We have broader goals for a patient now coming into managing hearing loss and also brain health expectations. And that will allow us to find possibilities to integrate or expand the technological suite for hearing aids for this particular purpose. Again, this is beyond the audiological benefit. This is towards a broader brain health benefit. And this is just the different phases of the patient journey that we could actually start as a template to develop, to expand, and to be able to come up with a nice agreement. And this is where I see the opportunity to create a bridge between brain health and hearing loss that then would allow us to nurture the gap in knowledge when it comes to the use of technology in hearing aids for brain health. So to summarize this short talk, so the link between hearing loss and cognition, as well as the impact of hearing aids, is more and more consistent. We see a lot of data coming in, and we see some of the findings being replicated in different longitudinal studies of aging. However, there's still self-reported hearing assessments, self-reported hearing interventions. There's a lot of rigor needed still to find the correct evidence. Hearing aid technology is currently at an underexplored stage with respect to brain health potential. This is not surprising, given that the technological suite is only just evolving for audiological benefits. It is now our opportunity to start to probe this for brain health benefits and brain health potentials. And there's an opportunity to redefine the interaction between hearing care and brain health, maximizing the use of available technology, and why not drive the development of new technology and policy around brain health and hearing loss. With that, I'll close this talk and thank you all very much for your attention. And I'm very happy to answer any questions that you may have. Maureen, I can't hear you. I don't know if you're muted.
How about there? Is that better?
Yeah, no? I can hear you. Yeah.
A different mic. Okay. The idea of using data logging and taking it to a much higher level where it can give people immediate feedback like they get with their watch, where they see how many steps and they have a motivation and a goal. That's really exciting, the idea of using that level of technology to give the patient immediate feedback so that they can see where they're at. And then, because when we talk about hearing aid compliance, we know how hard that is with kids, and with adults, the data logging, we don't want to be the hearing aid police, but still want to be able to give them good feedback. And if the hearing aid itself, maybe we sell hearing aids with a certain watch or app that will give them immediate feedback instead of something that they look at once in a while if they're even thinking about it. But one question was, we've been telling, regarding what Professor Dawes said about cognitive function and how it impacts hearing and back and forth, we've been telling clients that hearing impairment may impact their cognitive function, but we usually don't talk about it the other way around. So it certainly gives us a lot to think about.
It does. And some of the early studies, Elaine, you would have been involved in some of those as well. We're actually looking into how does cognitive capacity affect the use of or the performance in hearing aids. So I find that a very interesting play on words. Which one you put before it's very interesting, and I think nowadays we're more concerned about the effects in cognition and how this has a trickle down effect than the other way around, because we've shown that the current technology does actually ameliorate cognitive load, does actually allow users to go to more unexplored sound environments than before. So now it's about targeting the other way around.
Excellent point. Thank you. And everything tied in so beautifully. Thank you to all three of you for sharing. Wish we had more time with all of you, but we'll definitely have to look at some of your references and read some of the papers.